Welcome to episode 4 of Soccerheads New England. We're going to get a little serious here, I think, today, as we welcome the author of Lost Locker Room. Stephen Griffin's going to be talking with us in a few minutes. I'm Dave Rattigan, tortured for years at the hands of a sadistic soccer coach practicing mind control techniques alongside Jim Ruberti and Paul Nardizzi, comedians and former college soccer players who think it's normal to wake up in the middle of the night to watch soccer on television. And with us, Steve Griffin, author of Lost Locker Room, which came out this year, and previous book, a fictional account of the same thing called Front Row Seat. Really interesting. I want to get to a little business, and then we're going to get to a little bit of, and then we'll talk about the meat of the episode. Let's start with this. We want you to pay attention to our sponsor, financial advisor Rick Spencer, sponsor of Soccerheads New England. If you want your kid to have the best opportunities life has to offer, college is part of that, and you probably want to have a financial game plan. For years, Rick has been speaking to parents at free seminars for soccer clubs, youth leagues, and the general public. He's helped thousands of students from all over New England get into the right school for them at the right cost, and he can do that for you. So have Rick come speak to your club, team, league, or group, or to check him out at one of his free seminars in your area, call him at 978-857-7573. That's 978-857-7573. Financial advisor Rick Spencer, sponsor of Soccerheads New England. I also want to plug the Soccerheads experience. If you're a league, club, or other organization and you want to have a great fundraiser for your organization with comedians, with other stuff, with a wonderful experience, all themed around soccer, you can get Jim, Paul, and myself to come on down for the Soccerheads experience. You can call me, Dave, at 978-828-9532. I also have an email. It's Dave at scampscomedy, SCAMPS comedy.com. So that's Dave at scampscomedy.com, Soccerheads experience, and that brings us right to this, which is Steve. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things that we started to talk about before we started, but then we started to talk about this just a few minutes ago, but we thought we'd do it on the air, is I was a sports writer for a long time, and one of the things that, it doesn't happen often, but every so often, you have a coach or a league president or somebody who's in charge, and they, let's call it embezzlement, basically. They benefit financially from the league. In my opinion, it's usually not because of that was what their intention was. I think they just get into trouble, or they're mismanaging their funds because they're not very organized.
Dave sees the good in the world, Jim.
Oh, yeah, he sucks.
I think many of them get in there exactly for that reason.
You think they get in there?
There's 5 positions available. You want to be boys director? You want to be girls director? Or do you want to be the treasurer? The treasurer sounds like I get to run the checkbook for the club? Yes, I'll do that. In fact, I'm from Framingham. Framingham United had an incident about 4 years ago. The guy did some time. He was the treasurer.
He did time?
Yes, he did. He was the treasurer, and he was taking money, and everyone was sort of buddy-buddy with everyone, so no one really decided to look into it for a while, and he made off with a lot of money because his business was failing, and he was funneling the money over there.
Right. And this is generally the way it comes out. People don't check on their friends, and sometimes people have trouble in other areas of their life, so they move the money over, and everybody intends they're going to pay it back.
Hopefully we're not giving anybody ideas to become treasurers.
I like the idea that Paul is talking about how these guys become treasurers so they can steal from their league, and then we're going to come back and say, and if you want to raise money for your league, Soccerheads experience. Call Dave at 978-828-9532.
The only forum for the treasurers of all.
And as we get into our topic, just please remember that our sponsor today is no way affiliated with the now defunct GPS.
Yeah, not defunct GPS, which is what we're getting to. And here's the thing, and by the way, we talk about this with soccer leagues, little leagues, football leagues, hockey leagues. It happens. It's whether you believe that it's intended for the reason of if it's intended to be criminal when it starts, or if they just kind of slip into it and kind of wind up over their heads. It depends on how charitable you want to be to people. This, however, that we're going to be talking about now, Steve, This was nothing like that, was it?
No. It's this is an extreme example. Although I will say I'm not sure that any of the characters involved started out planning on getting involved in criminal activity. I would like to give people the benefit of the doubt and think that it was probably circumstances of a business growing, starting to get a little bit too big for them. They were having difficulty getting enough coaches, and this goes back 10 plus years as the business was expanding. And for the soccer division specifically, they built the business heavily around foreign coaches who came to the U.S. on work visas.
And it seems like one common thing throughout the saga is that they were faced with choice points.
Yep.
And at every turn, it seems, or many turns, they made the wrong choice ethically.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there,
Sure.
I think ultimately this really what you're talking about here. This is a story about youth sports, but it's really a story about business ethics and even personal ethics. And there were stepping off points along the way. And what's really interesting is if you back up a little bit. My background is I'm a CPA by training. I have a private equity background. We've invested in hundreds of businesses over the years, due diligence, even more. And I thought,
you ever invest in a podcast?
No, no,
and you won't after today.
And consider ourselves to be pretty good due diligence guys. But there's only so much diligence you can do, and you're relying on sort of your bias towards trust and the information that you're being provided. As much as you can scrub it and tick and tie the numbers, as we say, you're still relying on the information to being provided by the founders of the company. So we made an investment in the parent company of Global Premier Soccer, which was called Legacy Global Sports, in late 2017, early 2018. And it was only a matter of probably a month or two. We had our first board meeting, and we knew something was wrong. We could tell just by the financial statements and the sort of way the board package was presented and the way management was handling themselves that something was awry. And
financial statements shouldn't have whiteout on them.
yeah. And they were incomplete, right? Which not to bore your listeners.
And just stuff missing in space.
Yeah. So there's really, there's sort of three components to financial statements, not to bore you, but there's an income statement that's sort of like a motion picture of the last 12 months and how much revenue and whether or not the company was profitable. And then there's a balance sheet that's like a snapshot or a photograph at that point in time about the company's assets and liabilities and shareholders' equity. And then there's something called a cash flow statement that kind of bridges the two. It takes the profitability of the business, but actually ties it out to whether or not cash stuck to the ribs of the business. And the cash flow statement was not in the financial statements. And what's interesting is, as a numbers nerd, the cash flow statement for us tells us everything, right? So that was one red flag. And there were a number of red flags early on. But even as we got into a forensic mode and started really digging in and examining the books and records and watching how the business operated over the next several months, we never had any clue of where this thing was really going.
Interesting. And I told you this when we booked Steve to be here. I looked it up. I looked him up, and I saw CPA, and I saw the background, and I thought, wow, an accountant writing a book, this is going to be fascinating. But I also I thought, forensic accounting oftentimes is where this stuff gets opened up. And I don't know if you had a background. Is a CPA?
Yeah, I don't actually have a forensics background. And nor did I ever have any desire to write a book, which is interesting. I'm probably one of the least creative people in the world. Not to jump ahead, but I wrote the first book, quite frankly, during the COVID lockdown, after our investigation we felt was complete, and after we had gone through sort of a spin cycle with the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and other federal agencies. And so I found myself on the Cape with my wife and kids in the middle of a global pandemic, and my company had gone into bankruptcy, and I had just been diagnosed a little bit earlier with Parkinson's. And so it was my world was kind of upside down, and someone suggested, maybe it might be cathartic to keep a little journal. And I took a couple stabs at writing a journal early in the morning and realized I'm not Ernest Hemingway. So I tore those pages out and decided maybe I'll just put down what's happened the last couple of years from a business perspective, with sort of, blending youth sports as a cautionary tale of what happened, weaving through it a little bit of accounting without boring people. The forensics feels more like a white collar crime story that can be somewhat engaging, and then sort of an underlying kind of human condition, right? Everybody's dealt with shit in their life at some point, and kind of weave that through and give people a little bit of hope at the end of no matter how bad things can get, no matter what you face every day, you can suck it up and get through if you've got some good family and friends around you. So it's a little bit of a different story.
Yeah, so I'd like to go back to the beginning, right? As a business group, as an investor group, we were talking Mass Premier Soccer. You haven't mentioned their name yet. That was the original group.
Correct.
And they were purchased by GPS, correct?
Nope, they just rebranded it one point.
They just rebranded it, so
Correct.
it's still Mass Premier Soccer. A lot of our listeners would know who Mass Premier Soccer is. Turned into GPS. Where did you see how that could be an investment? As far as I knew they were growing rapidly, but where would your rate of return be? How did you get to that decision? And then we'll get right to the book, I'm sure, but I just want to know how that translated for you guys.
Great question. So I had made several other investments in the youth sports space leading up to this. So what is youth sports for us? It's subcollegiate, right? So it's events, it's club programs. It could be one-off tournaments where entire teams come. It could be showcases where an individual player comes. It could be international tours where a family wants to have a blended sports and cultural experience with their kids. And my prior experience had not been in soccer. I'm not a soccer guy by trade. I had invested in a couple of baseball companies and related businesses. And what we liked about this market is a few things. Number one, it's what we call asset light. We don't own equipment. We don't own land. We don't own buildings. We're pretty nimble in that regard. So we're not tying up capital in hard assets. It's not a business that requires a lot of capital, number one. Number two, it's an event business. So it's actually what I'd call an inverted cash cycle. You typically get paid by your customer long before you actually deliver the event or the service, right? So again, working capital wise, it's a business where you're usually in funds and not holding a lot of receivables or waiting to get paid. Thirdly, it's an industry that's, as you probably all know, has exploded over the last sort of 20 years, right? I mean, I grew up playing Little League Baseball and American Legion Baseball, and the idea of traveling and getting on an airplane with my dad to go to a baseball tournament didn't exist, right? It's gone crazy. The U.S. youth sports market is about $15 billion a year and growing at 5 to 7% a year, and has proven during the last financial meltdown to be completely recession-proof. Families will spend even in the most dire economic times. In fact, I was a little bit skeptical coming out of the pandemic if we'd see a bounce back where we were before. I kind of wondered if parents would say, you know what, we want to be out, but we've realized we can do a lot of things together as a family at home. We don't necessarily have to scatter again. The numbers are back in most cases ahead of where they were pre-pandemic. So it's proven to be a recession-proof business. Now, look, we're capitalists, right? We're investors. But we also saw an opportunity in the youth sports market where we felt that the product that was being delivered to parents, the bar had been set pretty low. Parents, in my opinion, do not get a lot of value for their money. Prices have gone way too high, and the cost to participate has become prohibitive for a lot of socioeconomic strata. A lot of kids can't play anymore, or a lot of kids are getting forced into early specialization. So our investment thesis was all those things I said, plus we could deliver more value to the customer by bringing a more professional investment process, capital, infrastructure, back office, and get things consolidated. And one of our sort of secret sauces, if you will, was our partnerships in the past with the likes of Nike and Adidas and others, where that sponsorship money could come in and reduce the cost for the parent to play and build a brand affinity between ourselves, a global brand, and the families. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I just want to see. Yeah, I mean, your growth is getting more people involved, getting more children involved, making it more affordable, correct?
Correct.
Expanding your bandwidth when it comes to limited amount of kids playing. And and obviously, and then you would have to give a quality product.
Yep.
So you'd have to bring in good coaching.